Okay. So good evening, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share some of my preliminary research and current ideas I've had during my ongoing doctoral research. And also thank you for your patience while I sorted out the Wi-Fi issues. As you have seen on the flyer, my name is Victoria Szafara, and I am a second-year postgraduate researcher at the University of Leicester. I'm interested in items of dress in Roman Britain, particularly the fasteners which would have facilitated various suites of dress. Even more specifically, in my research, I am homing in on a discrete subset of brooches, which includes the types commonly known as headstud brooches, trumpet brooches, and their variants. In this talk, I will present some patterns of where these small finds have been found in order to provide a regional backdrop of how widely these may have circulated in the province geographically and how popular these fashions may have been. I will then delve into a few case study examples wherein the brooch's particular archaeological contexts, including details of site type and associated finds, may give clues to some of the roles these items could have played in Romano-British social history. As most, if not all of you will already know, there is a vast array of different Roman-era brooch forms which can be assigned to a type in various existing classification systems or typologies, which themselves differ in manner and degree of specification. In principle, the existing typologies that are commonly used now would agree with the major criteria for identifying a brooch as either a headstud or a trumpet, the types on which I am focusing currently. At the far left here, we have an example of a headstud brooch. At its most basic, the headstud is a Colchester derivative brooch with wings and a curved profile. This displays an array of pin attachments, either sprung or hinged. Most, although not all, of these have the characteristic eponymous stud at the crown of the bow, and these can take differing forms, such as a crest, double stud, or concentric cast stud, which may likely have been colored with enamel. This brooch type is notable for its ornateness, and many examples display varied patterns of molding or enamel work on the bow and wings. There's commonly a foot knob at the base. This type is also identifiable according to a loop at the head of the bow, either loose or cast, as is here. For trumpets, standard trumpet brooches are classed according to their trumpet-shaped head, most often including a sprung pin. There are many examples where the brooch's axis bar continues up to form a head loop with a separate collar, though cast head loops are also common. A particularly distinctive element is that the bow of the classic trumpet brooch has a knot or decorative molding at the upper middle point on the bow, which varies in form and elaboration, from smooth curved discs to petaled designs, which may or may not continue to the back of the bow. Such an example can be seen in this trumpet brooch from the Vindolanda Trust collection, which I was lucky enough to have examined this past November. At other times, the knot can take the form of a plate rather than molding, as the example at far right, which has a peltis-shaped knot. Trumpet brooches as a class are considered one of the most distinctive products of the Romano-British brooch industry, and these may have developed from native late Iron Age brooch types, such as the trumpet-headed shape parallels from early Aylesford burials, which you'll see at the left. So variants and close relatives. Identifying distinct variants and close relatives of a brooch type is a task which is perhaps more open to debate, especially given that development of new brooch forms was not neatly linear, and the vast range of brooches from Iron Age and the Roman period show affinities and relationships with so many other types. And so now it makes the most sense to highlight just a few examples which I've been looking at due to their bearing close resemblance to the more standard types and sharing many of the same diagnostic features. Some examples can be viewed on the current slide. The brooch at left, again, comes from Vindolanda and is a variation of the trumpet brooch, now with a decorated fan tail and central circular plate. At center is a bow brooch whose body comprises an enameled fly or moth beneath the distinctive trumpet-shaped head, which is topped with a cast head loop. And at right, we have a Roxeter brooch, which contains a head stud and foot knob, but is seen with a simpler cast stud on the upper bow. The examples on the past two slides are not exhaustive, but do summarize some of the diagnostic elements which link more specific types into a series for more targeted study. These types, as a discrete series, not only share diagnostic elements related to form, but they stand out as including examples of some of the most ornate bow brooches of the period. It has been noted previously by others that such decorative elements like enameled work, white metal trim, and lattice triangular and curvilinear designs, which feature in examples from this series, are identifiable features of the British brooch manufacture. The chemical analyses conducted by Bailey and Butcher for their 2004 study into the Richborough collection lent further weight to this observation. As some of the most distinct products of British brooch manufacture, these may prove a rich data set to study changing tastes and developments in craft technology for Roman Britain in its heyday. The types follow similar chronologies, although there is variation regionally and according to more specific subtypes. On the whole, the series would have been popular during the late 1st century into the 2nd century CE, at which point bow brooches of all kinds occur less frequently in the archaeological record. But most importantly, and most pertinent to this presentation, I found it made sense to isolate this series as a discrete set due to some long-standing questions which have been asked of the brooch types related to identity in Roman Britain. You'll have noticed from these images that very often, although not always, the brooches in this series carry the head loop feature, to which a chain could have been attached to link a pair of brooches securing a peplo stress on each shoulder, as seen in these examples. Instances of funerary and iconographic evidence, particularly from continental Europe, provide further support for how these artifacts may have featured in female-gendered suites of dress. Some examples here include the widely cited costume of Manaman on a tombstone from the Mainz-Weissenau region, and an artist's rendering of such a 2nd century costume. But many scholars have decried assigning gender to such an artifact, as well as offered alternate possibilities for the head loop feature, be it a place to attach decorative chains or safety cords, which links the brooches to garments to prevent casual loss. In essence, though, this debate highlights the difficulties of isolating specific uses for individual artifacts, which of course could have been used in many different ways by many different people prior to deposition in its archaeological setting. Still, it is worth further exploring to what extent contextual analyses of these finds in British contexts reveal further details regarding how these were used to facilitate particular suites of dress, and whether, in turn, more may be said about the persons who practiced these dress traditions nearly 1800 years ago. Although I am still at the stage of ongoing data collection, and it would at any rate be impossible to answer all of these questions in a short talk, for now, I hope to give a few preliminary results and case study examples which touch on the themes of dress as a dynamic lived tradition in Roman Britain. So, how far did these fashions penetrate geographically? Firstly, it is helpful to establish where these brooches have been found and in what sorts of quantities. Even though there will be biases or factors which resulted in the known surviving archaeological record, geographic patterns of brooch loss are helpful in establishing trends in where these were being worn. As an early exercise in my research, I performed a quantitative assessment to get a sense of the strength or popularity of this series in the British archaeological record. I synthesized brooch records from the Portable Antiquities Scheme online database, the Rural Settlement of Roman Britain database, and records compiled in the 2011 Compendium of Don McCrath. Other scholars have similarly completed useful distribution mapping for brooch loss patterns according to types and subtypes, studies that in many instances have resulted in distinct distributions which suggest either centers of manufacture or consumption. A few such recent studies are works by McIntosh and Ponting on the Wirral brooch, and the series of studies by Kuhl and Baxter in 2016 for trumpet brooches from the McCrath corpus, as well as various brooch-loss patterns tracked in Michelle Statton's 2016 doctoral dissertation. But in this instance, my goal was to compare the strength of the Headstud-Trumpet series compared to other contemporary brooches identified in the same counties and regions. Although in many ways this exercise glosses over nuances of chronology, it is helpful to show the relative popularity of such brooches compared to others which populated the Romano-British landscape, especially where histories of excavation and reporting schemes vary. For example, we won't find items for Scottish context in the PAS. Anyway, what you're looking at is what I found. What is initially noticeable in this chart, which depicts the representativeness of the Headstud-Trumpet series given as a percentage of total Roman brooches, is the relative prevalence of these styles in Yorkshire, the Northwest, Scotland, and to a lesser degree, Wales. These regions align well with the frontier zone at the time of the brooch's stylistic Florowitz, which is the mid-1st to 2nd centuries CE, rather than the more well-established principal towns of the south and southeast. It was at this time, in the Flavian period, where the Roman military pushed further into Wales and the northern half of the country, and where we see an overall increase in production and variety of brooches in the province. It's striking to me that when these brooch types and subtypes have been isolated from other types and simply spatially mapped, headstud and trumpet subtypes and variants do definitely show a more widespread distribution throughout the island, with typological clusters, for example, in the West Midlands or Eastern England, which you can see in this mapping of main trumpet subclasses by Hilary Kuhl and Mike Baxter. In many instances, these distributions have led others to identify workshops or centers of production slightly further south. Yet, when proportion in context of the wider assemblage of contemporary brooches is mapped, I find that more consumption-oriented questions spring to mind. For example, were there distinct regional brooch-wearing habits in these frontier areas? And if so, why? I do have to admit that these results do come from an earlier exercise, and I intend to update the data to include records derived from more recent print publications and gray literature reports, and then perform a refined distribution mapping exercise similar to this one. But I also believe that the trends depicted in this initial mapping suggest that Northern Britain is a potentially fruitful avenue for case study analysis to query what factors may be driving changes in brooches, in brooch form and fashion. I explained previously that the Headstud-Trumpet series stands out, as examples within that series often display elaborate decorative elements and motifs, including enamel work. In this line of thought, related to changes in fashion, it may also be worth noting that enamel work is sometimes thought of as a sort of frontier fashion in itself, with items like enameled disc brooches, including dragonesques, as well as other small finds like metal and enameled button and loop fasteners, and even enameled paterae or trulli, showing distinct distributions in the northern frontier zone. Further explanation of this point is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it helps to hit home the idea that these brooches both had specific uses and were part of a wider interconnected network of material culture, which both shaped and was shaped by the societies with which it interacted. And so this leads me to another question, which to my mind is more important and more difficult to answer. How far do these fashions penetrate socially? How did they function in Romano British society, and what may have been the major factors driving changes in style? And what might these tell us about the brooch wearing habit in Roman Britain? There are a few ways to answer this question about how these relate to social history, and what one such approach is examining brooches at the level of artifact assemblage artifact assemblages in closed context. Although perhaps an unconventional avenue to mine information about dress tradition, I'd like to briefly discuss a few case studies examples from hoard contexts in Roman Britain, which I got a little trigger happy and gave you a preview a few minutes ago. So we'll be looking at hoard contexts now. And I say unconventional because in the first place, it can be very difficult to identify practices of dress ensembles in the archaeological record, as the context in which we find these fasteners are often far removed from the action of wearing. The exceptions being the rare unfortunate situations like ancient drowning victims or bog bodies, where bodies in dress have the chance to be captured like a film still in time. The next best thing may be supplemental evidence for dress tradition, such as textual descriptions, iconographic parallels, or funerary contexts, where brooches may sometimes be found arranged on or around the deceased remains. But such arrangements may also likely be much removed from everyday dress. Even though the Headstud-Trumpet series brooch finds in hoard assemblages are arguably even further removed from lived practice of Romano-British dress, it is worth exploring this resource, especially since the types in the Headstud-Trumpet series do show marked associations with this assemblage type. In a recent published survey of Iron Age and Roman coin hoards in Britain, Bland, Chadwick, Gay, Hazelgrove, and Mattingly found that the two commonest forms of brooches associated with recorded hoards were trumpet brooches and penannular brooches, with the latter types largely confined to late 3rd and 4th century coin hoards. And so, what may such brooches discovered as part of hoards tell us about dress traditions? Here are just a few examples taken from more northern contexts in the province. At the top left of the screen, we have the finds of the Knutsford hoard in Cheshire, which included 103 coins dating from 32 BCE to the end of the 2nd century, 3 gilt trumpet brooches, you see there, and 2 finger rings. At top right, we see the trumpet brooches and double chain of the Chorley hoard from Lancashire, which were uncovered with a series of coins ranging in date from the reigns of Galba to Hadrian, which gives them a terminus postquem of mid to late 2nd century CE. And at bottom right, there are the finds of the Backworth hoard from Tyne and Wear, which includes 2 silver skillets, a pair of silver gilt trumpet brooches, 1 silver and 5 gold rings, 1 gold bracelet, 2 gold chains with wheel-shaped pendants, 3 silver spoons, more than 280 Roman denarii, and 2 first brass coins of Antoninus Pius. When discovered, that assemblage was also covered by a bronze mirror, and the date of deposition is likely thought to be 140 CE. I have chosen these instances specifically due to their containing trumpet brooches, which, when deposited, would have been placed together in a kind of suite, or purposeful arrangement, which hints that they, at one point, either in the past or the future that never was, since obviously they weren't retrieved in antiquity, there was an opportunity for them to be worn together in a distinct suite of dress. In his examination of the Backworth hoard items in the 1920s, Parker Brewis suggested that the head loops of the pair of silver gilt trumpet brooches would have facilitated the wearing of brooches in pairs, linked by a sort of chain, either made from organic materials or metal, as seen in the Chorley example. As I mentioned earlier in this talk, iconographic evidence, in particular funerary epitaphs of the Rhine Valley and Danube, helped develop the narrative of this brooch ensemble as gendered female. However, in the context of these particular British hoards, none of the associated finds or overall assemblages are definitively gendered or even indicative of a clearly defined profession. It may also be interesting if we expand our view to consider British hoards more generally. Perhaps the most famous instance of a British hoard which contains a paired set of brooches, or in this case, 2 sets, is the earlier Winchester hoard. This pair of brooches has this pair of brooches, or the two pairs of brooches, have previously been gendered, with one set of the matching Latin D2 brooches assumed to have belonged to a man and the other to a woman. I don't personally believe that the argument for the gendering of these two pairs as such is watertight, the logic being that they were found with torques of two different sizes, one larger and one smaller. But it is logical, and it does offer up an interesting challenge to the narrative that paired brooches would have been distinctly female dress ensembles. And by extension, the brooches which facilitated that ensemble may take on connotations of female gender. So, while the hoard examples may provide a possibility for how these brooches were worn, it is again far more difficult to link the how to a who. But occurrences of these brooch types in paired suites and hoard contexts may still yet give further clues to a particular cultural meaning or signaling. In her 2016 thesis, Michelle Staton noticed that the generally widespread distributions of Headstud and Trumpet series brooches indicate that these were unlikely to have been regional identifiers or visual markers of separate regional identity. Instead, brooch type may more likely be a signifier for other aspects of identity and mark out distinctions in gender, career, or social status. And this last suggestion is one that seems most logical in light of the association of these brooches with hoarded items of some value, as well as the relative tendency for these examples to include precious metals and enamel, and the sometimes marked level of decoration seen in examples beyond those discovered in hoard contexts. Whether worn singularly, as a linked pair, or maybe even in groups of three, as may be the case with the Knutsford trio, these may have found wider popularity due to associations with high status suites of dress, which may have been favored by individuals of some significant rank and status in late pre-Iron Age in Roman Britain. The possible cultural signals that these brooches may have encompassed may also speak to wider social attitudes embodied in dress practices, ones that were distinctly Romano-British and long-term. If we compare the late Iron Age Winchester hoard finds to the later 2nd century hoard finds, which share artifact type and arrangement, brooches found in multiples, then we may begin to surmise a level of conservatism over time in fashions, elite or not, within the wider brooch wearing habit. Also, it seems that the cultural preferences of the people who commissioned, bought, traded, and crafted these products chose to create a series of brooches in the case of the Headstud-Trumpet series, which, as the Roman period went on, contained examples which held on to native flavor in the case of decorative motifs. The common formal element of the cast or attached head loop would have allowed for the option of pairing and recreating a traditional dress arrangement, even as other formal and ornamental aspects of bow brooches changed. It is also notable that there are examples from funerary contexts of the Roman period wherein a brooch of the Headstud-Trumpet series is arranged on the body linked to another brooch of a different type, such as this example here from Gwildon Morden in Cambridgeshire. A bead corroded to the Iron Age bow brooch suggests that a string of organic material may have linked the two brooches in the funerary dress suite. Examples like this could support the idea that the act of pairing and the suite of paired brooches may have been more important than using matching pairs or even using brooches of the Headstud-Trumpet series. The types in this series could have simply been well suited for facilitating certain suites of dress, given their head loop feature. Beyond any specific suite of dress, the Headstud-Trumpet series brooches, like others, would have no doubt been used in many ways by many people of multivariate identity. Indeed, I've not said it explicitly yet, but it should be stated that these types are most often not found together as part of a pair or in any sort of context which is suggestive of their use in a particular dress ensemble. and even large collections of brooches found together rarely contain duplicates. But this is an exploratory line of questioning that I've recently begun pursuing related to the question of what social factors are driving changes in style, to which the answer may include an aspect of attitudes favoring overt display, but also an appreciation for traditional dress practices. Once my data collection is finished, I think a helpful next step will be mapping finds according to their social distribution in order to determine whether these typological changes were being urged on by a particular sector of the population, or if there really is some merit in my suggestion that these may have been markers of status, at least earlier on in the Roman period in Britain. A mapping of finds across the settlement hierarchy may also help to elucidate the trends I've observed for the relative strength of this series and the archaeological record, which was covered in the first half of my talk. I'd also like to investigate why we may see these trends for Headstud-Trumpet series in frontier contexts, and whether there may have been some cultural preference for certain suites of dress, even if the types of fasteners involved were being used more widely in the province. Ultimately, I hope that my ongoing thesis work can support or dispute these hypotheses, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to put the ideas forward, and I'm eager for any and all feedback or questions that you may have in response. So thank you again for your attention, and thank you to Stephen for organizing and sharing this evening's program. I've got a brief list of sources that I've drawn upon, and I have my email address. So I guess that's it.